Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the program. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Associate Director for the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to another one of our events for the fall 2020 semester. Today's event is the second in a collaboration between our two overlapping series for the year. Global Uprisings and Digital Forays in Middle Eastern Studies. The title of today's event is Archiving a Revolution, Smartphones, Social Media, and Protest. Both of these series that we are putting on this year engage, in the one hand, in global uprisings, the past 10 years of protest, disruption, and uprising in the Middle East, but also around the world and in our present. And the Digital Forays series, we're thinking through different ways in which we are living, researching, writing, and being in a digital age. This particular panel, piggybacking off of the one we had last week, is a very natural overlap between the two topics. We're thinking through today the role of digital communication, social media, smartphones in protests. This was a hallmark of the Arab uprisings 10 years ago and has only become a more integral way of the way we both experience protest and save, access and archive protest. So with us today, we have four really interesting scholars who are going to engage in a conversation about the different ways in which social media and smartphones are integral to the ways that we experience protests, both in the present and in the past, over the past 10 years. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank, first of all, our co-sponsors for today, which include the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle Eastern Studies, the Gray Art Gallery at NYU, and I'm sorry, there's one more that I've missed here. The Global Journalism Program at NYU. We are very thankful for their support and glad to have them here with us. And I will also note in the chat, folks will soon be getting some information on our two overarching series for the year and some information on our next event, which will be happening at an unusual day and time, but it's a special event on November 15th, which is a Sunday. I know it's a Sunday, it's kind of an odd time, but we'll have a special collaboration with two partners of ours in Hawaii to address issues of land, indigeneity, and heritage in Hawaii and Palestine. More information will be coming your way about that in the chat and on our website and over social media. Okay, in the interest of getting started here, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we're going to turn it over to each of them for about 10-minute reflection, thoughts on the topic for today's panel. After that point, our discussant will be reflecting on those initial thoughts and posing a few questions to our panelists. That whole sequence will last about an hour, after which we'll move to audience Q&A. In that period, we'll ask questions either that come to us through the chat, or if folks are interested in raising their hand and asking a question verbally, they'll be able to do so at that time. We'll have about 30 minutes of audience Q&A. And then following that, the formal period of the event will end. But if you want to hang back, chat with the panelists, chat with the organizers and the other audience members, we're more than happy to facilitate that. If there's a lot of us that want to do that, we'll create some breakout rooms. If not, we'll just hang back in this space, and kind of, recreate our poor simulacrum of the Kevorkian lobby after an event. Unfortunately, we don't have enough wine and cheese for anybody today, but we do hope to welcome you back to the Kevorkian Center to do that sometime soon. All right, so I'm going to introduce our speakers now and then hand it over to them. With us today, we are very, very lucky to have Omar El-Ghazi, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. He will be our first speaker, and then from him, we will go to Yasmina Matwali, who is an artist and filmmaker based in Cairo and Berlin. She's coming to us from Berlin today, if I'm not mistaken, and a member of the Mosreen Video Collective. Our third speaker today is Isra Ali. She is a clinical assistant professor in media, culture, and communication at NYU Steinhardt, and a feminist scholar who writes about militarism, citizenship, Islam, and culture. And our discussant today is Marie Grace Brown, who's coming to us from the University of Kansas. Where she is an associate professor of history and a cultural historian of the modern Middle East with a focus on the Sudan. I also highly commend everyone to her award-winning book, Khartoum at Night, which is a really, really delightful book and you know, something I go back to quite frequently. So without any further ado, I want to thank our speakers for being here along with all of you, and I want to pass things over to Omar to get things started.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, let me thank the Kevorkian Center for the invitation, and I look forward to the discussion that we will have. So the way that I thought of my intervention is in relation to looking back at the Arab uprisings of 2011 and thinking about what we've learned in terms of the ways that social media were used and experienced in the Middle East and North Africa, and also in relation to the Middle East and North Africa. So the kind of story of social media and the Arab uprising is a familiar one, that when the protests started happening in late 2010, early 2011, and how they spread across countries, pundits and many academics as well credited social media as this new variable to really shaking up the basically entrenched authoritarianism in the region, and crediting it for democratization and empowerment. And of course, 10 years on, we know that that is a very simplistic way to think about it. But even though we know that, like I think it is important to actually go back to that, to what we all felt at that time, and how much of a surprise these protests were, particularly how they moved from one country to another, that it was at the time something unimaginable and unthinkable that actually happened. And certainly when it is thought of within a communication system that for decades was really controlled. So you have, if you think, for example, of what happened in Syria in the 1980s in Hama, and the fact that there are very little, if any, images that emerged from the atrocities that happened then. There is this idea that, oh, if only people had smartphones, if only there was social media, perhaps that would have changed the course of events or reactions to it. So so a lot of like the narratives about what social media do to politics is actually better thought of in terms of what we imagined it would do, rather than how it is actually used and experienced. And I think that's perhaps like the first lesson to think about looking back at the past 10 years, is this difference and tension between the ways we talk about social media and the ways that it is actually used, and the practices that go within it, and how these meta-narratives attach themselves and stick to particular regions of the world, to subaltern communities, who a lot of the time in Western scholarship aren't, basically their agency and political subjectivity is taken away from them by attributing whether their empowerment or their radicalization to external features, and in this case, social media. So we see how that narrative oscillates between social media empowers people to like social media radicalizes people when it comes to terrorism, and how that conversation sticks to a place like the Middle East. And I think that that debate on whether and if social media had this impact or that really obscured basically the question of how do we use social media, and it distracted us from doing the social science work on how technology is implicated in questions of class, of nationalism, community, ethnicity, diasporic experiences, etc. Now, in my own research, perhaps we could speak of a school within media studies that follows Stuart Hall approach, which is Gramscian as well in terms of thinking of the culture, popular culture, and new media as a site of struggle, whether we're talking about class struggle or activist versus authoritarian governments struggle. And if we think of it as such a site, we can see how, whether in terms of narrative or technology, there is this fight basically in who gets to empower themselves through social media. So in terms of narrative, social media become a struggle for dissemination of information, in terms of spin, and certainly in terms of projecting doubt and on any material that emerge in the digital realm. And this is something that we could talk about in the Q&A. Or in terms of the technology itself, because certainly in 2011, perhaps governments at the time were taken by surprise over the way that young people and activists use technology, but they've certainly caught up with the best ways to use them, and we can think of that in terms of surveillance and censorship, and also social media companies themselves. It is important to differentiate how, for instance, Facebook looked like 10 years ago versus how it looks like now, not only in terms of technological affordances, but also in terms of their business model and how they shifted from this idea of using social media for self-expression to the acquiring and selling of data, and this much more blatant profit-oriented operation that they're involved in. So kind of to recap, my idea is not denying the importance of social media, because we've seen its importance in the immediate mobilization of protest, but also in the realm of the effective as well. And this is not only in relation to 10 years ago, but also in the second wave of the uprisings that we saw, for instance, in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Algeria, where social media continued to play a very important role in mobilization, organization, and also imagination. And if we look at the research that emerged about social media, I'll talk about a few different just the dimensions of social media. So there's a move to speak of the importance of the body and the affective in terms of how we relate and experience social media. So here you can think of the work of Marwan Kredi on creative insurgency and the centrality of the body in relation to that. I have an article that's coming up soon about what I call affective proximity. And it's kind of a call to move beyond truth regimes as the exclusive frame with which to think about the interaction between news media and locals. So here my argument basically is to recognize the emotional labor of locals when witnessing and reporting war in their country and communities. And in terms of thinking about remembrance and archiving, I actually watched the discussion that you had a week ago, and about archiving, and I liked what Sana Yazji said about thinking about why we are, why do we seek to remember everything? While because people have a right to forget, and I like that idea because it points also to this affective and emotional aspect of memory. Particularly that actually sometimes remembering is very difficult to do for people who were involved and invested in the uprisings. One could give the example, for instance, of Facebook memories, when you see what you wrote, whether 10 years ago or 2 years ago, and people go like, oh, how come I was so optimistic or emotional? I feel so stupid for writing that, etc. So even in memory, there is emotional labor, and that is in the most positive way to put it, because obviously there's also trauma of violence and like the complete incapability of coming to terms with what happened in many countries. Am I doing good on time?
You have about a minute.
Okay. So that is also, I think, important to think about the affect of remembrance. And I'll mention two other things that I'll also be happy to elaborate on in the discussion. One is to also think of the words that we use in terms of mediation and memory. So for example, in my work, I talk about revolution, for instance, and how it was used in Syria, that we also have to think about the different nuances of meaning that it carried 10 years ago versus today, for instance, that the affective, basically the affect of these words changes the meanings of it. So revolution, for instance, in 2011 was a future-oriented word that people, wanted a revolution to happen, but then it shifted to becoming a past-oriented word, where it's actually about saying, I belong to the community of revolution. So there are nuances that words carry. And just a plug here that in the Journal of Middle East Culture and Communication, we have a series of special issues that will seek to basically reflect on these important words and how they shifted. And there's now a call for papers on Syria in relation to that. And my final point is also in relation to witnessing, that I think has been an important aspect of thinking about remembrance and mediation and meaning, because it is not that, let's say, an event happens and then there's a significant period of time until we understand what it means. With digital cultures of witnessing, immediately as something happens, it is being packaged and curated to feed into already existing narratives and discourses about what is happening, which creates this culture of competing digital witnessing, and that is one aspect of the disinformation that we see in the digital realm. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to elaborate on any aspect in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. That really sets the table for us. We're gonna pass things to Yasmina. You're muted at the moment too. You're gonna have to.
Hiya, hello everybody. I would like to, thanks for inviting me. It's been a while since I've talked about my work in the collective, in Musserin Collective, that you introduced, James, at the beginning. It's a very interesting moment right now for me, coming from Egypt, now being in Berlin, is to thinking about what is happening in the States, is to think also about the parliamentary elections in Egypt that are happening now, that are coming up in November, and how, I mean, that also brings back again a lot of memories from 2011, looking at who are how does the government look like, who is in charge, what is happening amid corona pandemic, what are the authorities doing, what are the security forces doing, and it just really reminds me a lot of something that's still the continuity of the previous regime. It's as though yet again you're reminded that nothing really has changed. But what I'd like to do, I'd like to come perhaps back to, we can talk a bit more about what's happening now, but I would like to maybe introduce the archive, the 858 archive that was part of in the past and still today. Jared, I can see that you shared the link. I would like to invite you to click on the link and perhaps check it out and navigate, and then we can talk some more. So yes, I mean, I was looking at the archive today and thinking about different moments of how did it come together? How did we, and by we I mean activists, filmmakers, people who were protesting and filming almost 10 years ago in Egypt, in Tahrir, in Suez, in outside of Cairo, in front of factories. How did this material come together? But I was reminded of the time where this particular archive was unnamed, and for a very long time it remained unnamed, and it made me think about the identity of archives, which is also one of the problematics of archiving or thinking about archiving. What will be its identity? What is its identity at the time of the making? Thinking about the urgency of documenting and the urgency of collecting and sharing while documenting. So the urgency to counter state propaganda, right? And then so thinking about that identity and also the identity in its framing. When does the archive start and when does it end? What's the frame, and what is the historical reference then? So I mean, the Egyptian uprising has gone down in history books as the January 25th revolution, and that too poses a problem. And I'm thinking about the beginnings of the January 25th uprising and how it started in Suez, in the port city of Suez, when protesters took over the streets on January 23rd in solidarity with the uprising in Tunis. And this is when the anti-state violence began in Egypt, which at the time was not yet that vivid, or I mean, it wasn't turned into a worldwide spectacle. It was actually quite hidden, and there's bits and pieces of information and mobile phone footage that was coming to us and by us I mean a group of people or groups of people dispersed elsewhere, also trying to track down what was happening. And it was also the time where that very attack that, I mean, I'm going back to that moment because it was that moment when something where the protest took a different, I mean, went a bit further. And it was the moment when a group of protesters targeted and besieged policemen. Targeted a police station, and then were attacked back with tear gas and live ammunition, and that stirred up things. And this was also the moment here the first martyr of the Egyptian revolt fell. I mean, so this is when I look at the material on the archive on 858, I go back to that moment where, when you look at the material today, it has that also, I mean, symbolic, but also significant quality of, when you look at the footage and its quality, and I'm not thinking about the quality of, uh, of, of, of the mobile phone, or the quality of the technology. I'm thinking about the way in which events were attempted to be registered. It was also a time where you were not, and now you can't document, you can't film police again. And back then it was also that moment. And it was very shortly after when the whole Egyptian revolution was turned into a spectacle and was mediated on television and worldwide and so on. But it really started with this risk, taking risk of filming and participating with your phone, with your body. And I'm thinking about also that engagement, not thinking about the archive and its identity and what's going to happen with this. It was really, in that moment, important to be shared, to reveal also the violence of the state. So I mean, the archive, in a sense, it started with that moment, and it continued in Tahrir with the 18 days, or actually 15 days of a sit-in, when on the 28th of January, people flooded the square from all over the country in response to Suez as well. And many of them were already engaged with battles in their own neighborhoods, and they brought their images with them. So the square turned into space of protest, gathering, speaking up, sharing stories. And it was also the space where the first media tent, I mean, it was the only media tent per se created, but it was that space that allowed for people to share their material, to recharge their phones, to take a break, to connect with, to look at other materials that were there. And these were images of protests, battles, police violence, documentation of various struggles, injuries, evidence of death coming from the morgues. So this was really the beginning of this practice of archiving, for the purpose of not necessarily thinking about what to edit and what to share, but to make sure that that there's evidence for now and also for later, not knowing what later would be, or what becomes of later. And yeah, and I've looked at, and it's interesting because on the archive, there's only one single entry from 23rd of January 2011, and that entry, that it's three files filmed in Suez that day. Whereas later you have much more coming from Tahrir, and you can see that practice of filming but also collecting is much more widespread. And having said that, of course, there was a lot more going on in Suez and at that day that we also, as a collective, did not access. So I mean, maybe my entry topic or my entry point would be how to speak of an archive. How to speak of an archive for me in relation to Egypt, thinking about the archive in the making, thinking about how everyone was in a way involved in creating it with their phones, with their cameras, with their flip cams. But it is also difficult not to speak because of that involvement, not to think about the archive without thinking of the spectacle or the sensation that was created around it. and how the footage that was filmed by people who were on the ground and not from the bird's view, not from the perspective of cameras, not from the perspective of journalists who would parachute in and leave with their story, how that changed the narrative, even if it was for that moment when it was allowed, and how that changed the way the world was watching and participating. It created a certain kind of closeness. So when I think about the archive or the bodies and the closeness, it also comes in there. And it was really felt. I remember these moments. So now I'm going to jump to 2017, which was the year when Musurin, which consists of a group of friends and people who were involved on and off with the archive, and thinking about what is it that we're going, how and where are we going to take this footage. We meet in 2017. So this is 6 years after the revolution. It's also very long 6 years of not really working so much on the archive, and also not being able to film or continue with this way of working and living. So we meet and we are faced with 15 terabytes of footage, mostly dumped on hard drives without any kind of organization model, without a specific hierarchy. There's no folder structure. So basically we spend 2 weeks looking through all the material and reorganizing it, creating a very specific system, folder system, that then would allow us to ingest the material into the 858 model, so into what is called Pandora, which is the system, the online platform that hosts 858 archive. So we spend this time looking at material that we haven't looked at for a very long time. And I remember thinking, while looking, how, or being reminded that it was also a deliberate act not to look at the archive for these years. And it was no deadline or beginning, but it was a combination of being fed up with the deteriorating political situation in Egypt, mixed with this utterly overwhelming anxiety with the political, the participatory, the personal failure within the larger framework of the revolution, but also within the more personal relationships towards people with whom I've personally filmed with or spent time with, hoping to change something. So you go through the material and you have all of these faces coming up with hopes and struggles, with all these voices and all these risks that they've taken. So I mean, in that sense, working on an archive in 2017 was a bit, when I think about it now, it was a bit like moving in a time machine, and moving back to that moment of urgency, because of the way in which this particular material is filmed. It's filmed in a rush. It's filmed now, and in this capture, in this way, or in this mode of capturing, I remember thinking about how these past events are not there only as a documentation of something that happened, that there was an agency there, and when you look at it, you can feel it, and you also feel anxious because you don't know what to do with it now. So I mean, yeah, just to wrap up, I would like to, there's questions that, we also posed to ourselves back then while working on the archive. We had these, and this is coming from our collective work. These are not my words. I mean, this is something that we discussed in a group, thinking about why this archive, why the archive now, and what matters. Is it the bodies on the street? So, I mean, we spent mornings discussing this, and particularly images that were very also violent, and thinking about how to avoid giving certain images too much power, because the struggle has not been yet resolved. So this is not also a success story. Whatever, I mean, I have a lot of issues also with that, with this idea of something that is finished, that is done, this archive is finished. Then also thinking about who took the images, which is a very important question, because there's a lot of people who also are either unidentifiable or do not want to be identified with the material, or for protection reason want to stay anonymous. So, when you think about image makers, you also think about who took the images, who captured them, and so I think there's something about that but also who protects who are the ones protecting, or who are the ones who are protecting the archive here. So I mean, we also had a lot of questions around authorship within the collective.
About it. Sorry, I'm sorry, Yasmina. We're kind of running over in time. We want to make sure we get to Isra, but we can loop back to these things in the discussion, I'm sure.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you so much, Yasmina. That was just such a rich discussion. I'm going to pass things now to Isra.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jared and James, for having me and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm super excited. I'm not a specific sort of expert on the Arab Spring, but I am really interested in mobile technologies and how people create networks and communities, and specifically in relationship to things like activism and uprisings, and very interested in war on terror militarism. So this is already a really enlightening conversation for me, and sort of in the spirit of doing that. Oh, hang on a second. In the spirit of doing that, of thinking about that, I just sort of wanted to take a little bit of time, maybe not even a whole 10 minutes, to pose some questions that I think about when I was reading sort of the prompt or thinking about what this panel is about. And I also just really wanted to thank the organizers for organizing a panel that sort of allows us to think about larger questions around the idea of archive and memory and social media, apart from what's specifically sort of happening on the ground. I think the questions that I have already resonate a lot with what Omar and with what Yasmina were saying in different ways. So I'm thinking about all of those connections. And I think the first thing that really comes to mind for me that I am interested in, and I think this speaks a lot to what Omar was saying about the affective in relationship to the archive, is the question of what is the fantasy of the archive that drives so many of our conversations about archival materials. And so a lot of us, especially those of us who are in academia or who use archival materials, have fantasies about ideal archives and fantasies about what archives can provide us, and how our proximity to the correct archive will provide this sort of view of the world that is closer to reality, or provide a different form of history that will change things. And so I think fundamentally a lot of what I've heard already is a lot of questions about this kind of affective or emotional relationship to the idea of archive and memory to begin with, that we come to the idea, the question of the archive, with already so many assumptions and hopes about what the archive can actually provide us with. And I know that when I'm considering my fantasies about what the archive is, I'm always fantasizing about a kind of ideal narrator, an ideal kind of subject to write things down, right? And so I think one of the things we want to consider is, who is it that we view as the ideal kind of narrator in these materials of the archive? And who is it that we fantasize is doing the work of documenting what's happening? Who do we consider to be these sort of voices that we want to amplify? And I think this speaks back to what Yasmina was saying about the idea of access and who it is that gets to say these things and talk about these things. So there's an interesting way in which a critical conversation about archives in the past sort of few decades of academia and thinking has led us to believe, I think, fantasize about a kind of ideal narrator of the archive who comes from a particular intersectional voice of different kind of marginalized perspectives that will then provide us with something that will give us a way of thinking about things very differently. And so I'm very interested in the fantasy of both the archive and the fantasy of who it is that does the work of narrating these things, or whose archival materials we look at, and then what the fantasy is about the preservation of particular moments and what it will do in the future, right? And so when we fantasize about what the archive is and we bring our fantasies to these particular moments, we have within that, I think, an idea of what the archive might do in the future, right? What work it might do. And we have a kind of assumption that perhaps in the future, the same particular actors or perspectives might be thinking about the archive in the same way that we are thinking about the archive, instead of considering how the landscape might change really dramatically, right? And how different people might be reading the archive from different perspectives. And so what we do in the present in terms of trying to document and trying to maintain archives, I think we might want to consider and think about, account for the future, but also ways in which nation states think about the future of the archive and retaliate. So I grew up in Bahrain. I went to, I moved there when I was 3 and I lived there till I was 13 as one of the many transient populations that move through countries like that, South Asian laborers and such who move through populations like that. And my dad was a professor, so he wasn't a laborer, but should make that distinction very clear. But there is this, I grew up around the Pearl Roundabout, right? And the Pearl Roundabout is this symbol in my personal memory that is a lot of what I connect to when I'm thinking about Bahrain and my childhood in Bahrain. And so when the uprisings happen in Bahrain, a lot of the gathering happens around the Pearl Roundabout, and the response of the state is to take the Pearl Roundabout down, right? Is to remove that symbol. And they pave over that and make it an intersection, and it's reopened, but they have sort of eviscerated the symbol there. And the nation state is, I think the Bahraini government is doing that not just to remove in the immediate, right, a space where people will gather and interact with each other, but also to remove the symbol that might then fundamentally deplete the symbolism of the archive and the memory, so that the future, right, will not see that as a place where people might once gather again. And so when we're considering our fantasies about what the archive is, we have to also understand the archive doesn't exist without response, right? That in fact, governments, I think again, this speaks to what Omar was speaking to about how governments acclimate very quickly to the uses of social media by different dissidents, right? In that they don't just say, oh, well, we'll give up this particular history. They figure out strategies, right, to come back and to reclaim those histories, and doing things like removing monuments like the Pearl Roundabout or spaces where these things happen, I think is part of this ongoing kind of interaction of the archive. Something, the archive continues to sort of be an alive thing, right? Beyond what we hope that it will be and what we're trying to do in the moment, there's the conversation that continues. And so it also made me think about how we're thinking about the phone and mobile technologies. And so on the one hand, we're thinking about mobile technologies and the phone, both as a device that stores things, but also as a device that broadcasts things. And when we're considering how mobile technologies work, we want to consider those two things distinctly and separately, right? And so how do we want to think about the phone as something, or any mobile device, that records and stores things? And then, is the ability to record and store in and of itself meaningful, or is it the ability to broadcast via the phone or mobile technologies what makes that information meaningful? And when I think about that, then I think about, of course, social media, right? And inherently how the notion of archiving things in this moment really necessitates social networks to amplify and make visible these moments in order to make them meaningful in an archive, right? And that means that inherently mobile technologies are connected to the ability to broadcast and the ability to engage in social networks and share information with people. So this means that the archive is something a little bit different than perhaps what we think of traditionally as the archive, because it's something that is shared. It is not static. It moves across places, right? It moves across places, and it is shared by individuals. And therefore, the archive is no longer a site that you visit, but it visits you, right? And depending on your networks, right, it depends on what you end up accessing. So the archive is increasingly dependent upon what networks we participate in and what information we have access to, if it's circulating on social media, right? If we're creating archives in the moment of historical moments that are occurring. So how does the notion of the archive change when we stop thinking of it as something that is static, that is formed, and that sits, and it becomes something that actually moves towards us, as opposed to something that we visit and gain access to? I mean, think about all the fellowship applications you write and how different they are if you no longer have to be like, I will travel to X archive. Instead, archive travels to me, right? No one wants to give me money to go visit archives that visit me, right? So I can't be, there's no plane tickets involved. The archive just comes towards me, right? And so when we're considering the technological kind of component, right, and how it meets the fantasy of the archive, we want to maybe think about how things continue to be mobile, and how individual users then of social media actually become repositories, become archivists, right? They become the ones who save things. And then there's a very, again, an affective component, a kind of sentimental, personal component to saving in things that you see as they move through social media, right? And so there's a fundamentally affective kind of personal, individual, and sentimental component to the ways that people draw things off online and keep them, and then revitalize them later and circulate them, right? So it's not just that it circulates once, but people often reinvigorate things. And this is often also encouraged by affordances, by media platforms that do things like invite us to share our memories a lot, right? They're always inviting us to be like, what happened on this day 4 years ago, right? So there's a kind of way in which we're trained to utilize social media to invoke this kind of nostalgia. So archives are now involve, right, as they're moving on social media, involve individuals who are then responsible through things like nostalgia, of sharing and reinvigorating certain archival materials and making sure they kind of circulate. I always think about Vine, the app that predates TikTok, and the nostalgia for Vine, and how people share their Vines, their favorite Vines all the time. And in that way, individual users, through their love of particular Vines, maintain a kind of archive of Vines, even though the app has kind of long gone. And it's an interesting kind of collective, but completely informal and uninstitutionalized version of putting sort of archives together, right? And thinking about them sort of together. So those are some of the things that I think about. And then, of course, I think just one last thing that I wanted to sort of put out there. Is it the last thing? I should probably check my notes. It's probably like 10 other things. No, it is the last thing. One of the things that I wanted to, oh, actually, I did want to add that I wanted to pick up on what Yasmina was saying about the role of people and individuals. And so there is a talk that I share with my students by Zeynep Tufekci about the contrast between between the civil rights movement networks that were built on face-to-face interaction, where people were talking to each other to do things like build carpools during bus boycotts, and how that we should contrast with the ability to build networks very quickly online, but maybe perhaps not sustain those networks over periods of time. So how people, both as individuals who are participating and sharing archival material, but also as individuals who do the work of through storytelling and face-to-face interaction and other personal kind of contextualization, actually do the work of making the archive something that is part of an active and kind of dissenting or uprising kind of movement, right? And then, of course, we always have to consider when we're thinking about social media and we're thinking about documentation, the flip side of that, which is surveillance. And again, picking up already on what Omar and Yasmina have been talking about, right, that surveillance is fundamentally, right, a component of documentation, and thinking about the balance of that, or thinking about ways in which we might then invite surveillance to participate or become part of something that is part of the archive, right? And so you have on the one hand surveillance in a way that we have to think about in a context related to social media platforms as corporations, and how their interests increasingly in becoming builders of infrastructure around the internet, doing things like laying undersea cable networks or building the internet infrastructure in Indonesia, makes them really vulnerable to governments who will essentially bargain, right? The ability of these companies to operate freely in their countries or in their oceans, to participate in building infrastructure, to build their companies up in exchange for the ability to surveil dissidents or gain information about people who are presenting a problem to the state, right? And so we want to think about the ways in which social media platforms as corporations have fundamental interests that make them vulnerable to government's desire to surveil activists, but also the ways in which users utilize surveillance, sometimes to their advantage, sometimes to force a kind of making of an archive visible. So one of the things that I do in part to make my research program slightly more fun is look at Muslim students who make memes about their experiences in the era of the war on terror. And they are actively incorporating or speaking to or inviting the existing surveillance of them online to assert a kind of narrative, right? And they're not actively engaged in an Arab Spring-like uprising, but they are engaged in the process of articulating a version of citizenship or claiming a version of citizenship that the government, that they feel is hard to do when the government has become a sort of unstable or unreliable actor in the process of convening or conveying citizenship, right? And they are doing that with the awareness that they are being surveilled, right? And so we want to consider, I think, surveillance also from a sort of multitude of perspectives. So those are really the sort of questions that come up for me in relationship to these ideas. And I think the other talks have been really helpful, and I'm really looking forward to what Marie has to say and to the Q&A also.
Thank you so much, Isra. I want to pass things off now to Marie, who's going to offer some reflections and a few questions. We'll have a couple rounds of those with the panelists before we open up to audience Q&A.
So, wow, it's such a privilege, but also I think a real challenge to be asked to synthesize these really thought-provoking conversations. There's so many different directions to go in, and I've got notes that are sort of scattered all over. But I think that the thing that really stuck out to me the most, and that I was so rewarded to see, was the emphasis that everyone has placed on the human quality or the human actions, behaviors, and intent behind technology. And I think that's so important in helping us to get past sort of these binaries that online space is somehow distinct from the socio-political physical space that we move through. And I think we set up very similar spaces with archives too, right? So thinking about the fantasy of the archive, it is this thing that you travel to and it doesn't exist in our everyday space. And so I think what is most helpful and I think most sort of informative or instruction is to really be sort of reminding ourselves of the connections between these different types of spaces, these different types of collections, and that it is the human, right, the body that moves back and forth through these spaces, and and that relates to this idea of the archive being unmade and in a constant state of becoming, which is again so different than how we traditionally think about the archive as a static collection of documents. And so one of the revolutions that I think we should be acknowledging here is not just these socio-political movements, but a revolution in who qualifies as an archivist, right? Who gains the authority to not only collect, but then curate, right? And catalog and then disseminate. And we've certainly seen a democratization of that, though I think there are certainly obviously still sort of high barriers to entry, but I think one of the revolutionary moments we should be pointing to is it is the notion of archivist is also certainly changing. I wanted to just sort of start with sort of point of privilege and connect this to my own work, which is about the body as historical text and the body as a site of memory and history making and archival work. And really to think about how bodies and technologies are literally in the same frame, so that the advertised image for this talk was a man spotlit by a number of cell phones around him, right? And so you presume there is the cell phone taking the picture of him, but also taking pictures of all other cell phones taking a picture of him. And Isra had said that phones store and record. And I think we have to remember that that phone is attached to a body, and that phones have become accessories. They have really become parts of our bodies. They are wearables. And so I wanted to start by just asking each person to sort of think a little bit more about this connection between the digital technology that is producing these archives and the bodies that are carrying these pieces into the protests. It is the bodies, right, who feel the violence of security forces, of wind and rain and hunger, and so I guess my question, my first one is, how might we sort of recover some of that fleshy bodily quality, the humanness of the people that are attached to and behind and in front of these technologies that are creating these new revolutionary archives. And I'll let anyone pop in and go first.
Yeah, I could I guess speak first. So yeah, I think that is a fundamentally important point, and I'm glad that like I also learned a lot from the other speakers who also talked about that aspect. And I think like in my research, for instance, about how people felt at the time, there is a sense that basically it's kind of like a stage before making meaning or having expectation of what their actions intend to achieve. Rather, there is like when people remember protesting, particularly when it's in a very risky and dangerous situation, like they have a sense of being forced to do something, in the sense that there's this vacuum in terms of telling the story of what's happening in your country or your community, and you feel forced to report and witness out of a sense of civic duty, out of a sense of national kind of belonging, and particularly when we're talking about like that takes different forms, and depending on what country we're talking about. Sometimes it's at the level of a village, and other times it's more like a national spectacle. But I think the idea of putting your body somewhere without actually having, even to your own self, rationalized why you are doing so. It is, I think, that like to that level of the effective basically participation. So the technology is definitely a big part of that, because it's, you know, it is the way that you're gonna disseminate your presence, and perhaps it would also help you make the meaning after you put your body there. So that, you know, that can be thought of in a positive way in terms of like the euphoria and the excitement at the time, and the kind of mobilization that happens. But of course, that also like that comes with a huge risk to your body, and also with a lot of emotional labor that stays with you after the event, and with the caveat that, of course, we're a lot of the time talking about basically life and death situations. So it is about courage as well. So yeah, like that's what I would say.
Isra, you're muted.
Oh, did I just unmute myself?
Yes.
I didn't mean to unmute. I was just asking, are we all taking, I didn't, do you want us all to answer?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
I'm sorry, would you just remind me, because I feel like I don't want to mess up. I was thinking about something and then I don't want to mess it up I was thinking what Omar was saying, but go ahead. Would you remind me again what the question was?
I guess the question is, how might we reinsert or highlight the flesh and the physical body into these constructions of digital archives, right? How do we acknowledge the connection between the body and the technology?
Right. I was thinking about what Omar was saying and I got off on a tangent. But yeah, I think this is actually this is a central question of media studies in many respects, of a question of representation versus how do you make something tangible through an mediated kind of context that allows then people to react in a way that then allows them to move and think or take what happened and not just remove it and think about it as something that is distant or far away. And how does one keep the kind of fleshy quality? And I mean, I think what I find is that there is this constant kind of emphasis on the part of users to try and input the fleshiness, whether it's through GIFs or memes or creating some kind of motion in instead of static kind of images, or through emoticons, right? Or through the revival or circulation of archival material as part of nostalgic kind of moments, or as moments of thinking or having memory in their day-to-day kind of life. But I think fundamentally the question of how to bring those things forth, you can look at attempts by other big archival projects like Holocaust archival efforts, for example, and how they have really emphasized recording the voices of people who were part of this historical moment, and recording their faces, and trying to imbue the body and the experience of the body into the archive, so that when you interact with it even decades later, you can experience that on some level. But I think that is an ongoing kind of tension and struggle that is at the heart of thinking about how media and technology might actually participate in creating a better world. And I think sometimes, as in the case of this most recent presidential election, you think that there is great impact being made because people are conveying effectively how politics is impacting them in their day-to-day lives, and impacting bodies. And then you realize through votes that not everyone is really impacted by those stories. And in fact, a lot of people aren't seeing things on social media and being greatly moved by the pain of others, right? In fact, that the pain of others pales in comparison to saving some money on their taxes. So this question of how to do that, I think, is maybe bigger than I can answer. So maybe I'm not being very helpful and I should mute myself now. So
I'm sorry, I just keep listening to more and more of what every participant has to say. And I'm also lost in the question because I was also taking notes and I'm thinking about all the notes I took because there's so many interesting points. And so maybe I can share like this image that I have in mind. I'm not sure, like maybe it's a bit of an anecdote. I'm thinking about this particular image that comes back in the when thinking and narrating the Egyptian revolution is the burning of the NDP building, the ruling party. And I mean, it's this moment that appears, it's this moment when, you know, there's this feeling of success. I mean, moment of the beginning of celebrating for protesters who took over Tahrir. So you have in the video, there's a lot of videos that show the NDP building, the building of the ruling party going down in flames. And then in the archive, one of a friend, one of the Mussolini members is you know, found this video of one of the videos showing the NDP building burning, and the person who's filming the building is trying to focus on that event. People are running away from the smoke. You have police, protesters. There's a lot of things happening. He's trying to get the person filming is trying to get a sense of what's happening and trying to focus his camera on these different moments to capture everything. And then there's a moment where you see a man crossing through the frame in a suit with a suitcase, as though he was coming or going back to home from an office. And he's really he doesn't belong to the scene and to that moment. And in that moment, the camera kind of forgets about the event and goes to that person, focuses on this moment of you know, crossing, and this is the moment also of fiction, also, or almost fiction, that also becomes part of that documentation, or it becomes part of that practice of documenting or attempting to document the event. Is that somewhere inherently it is, like you said earlier, that there's something about, you know, these particular political archives created by protesters, created by people who, as they film, they also create a narrative through the way in which they look at, and through the gaze and through the likeness and through reflecting back and through their bodies, but also through, you know, their focus. So it's not a static collection, because it moves within, like that narrative changes within the documented material, and then within not a consecutive timeline. Thinking about the timeline of the archive, there's many timelines, and they do not necessarily follow the same pattern, because you have so many people contributing and entering and exiting in different moments and changing their focus. So I'm thinking about this example as this way of also changing the focus and surprising someone who's looking at it on a computer screen with that moment. I don't know, I mean, it's not really an answer to maybe your question, but
no, I think that's wonderful, and a great answer, and relates to something that sort of Omar said, that the body precedes rationalization, right? And so this moment of moving from the scene to following the man walking across the frame is the human interaction, right? That is the human experience of that moment. And so I think that's so helpful in that perhaps it's these accidents, right? Or these sort of missteps that help us to understand the human quality of the experience. I'm thinking of something that a panelist said in last week's session: the body reacts, and that I think is what, in some sense, digital technology helps us to do, is that it captures these reactions a lot more than other forms of documentation. I'm mindful of time, so Jim, do I have time for one more round of questions, or should we move to audience Q&A?
Yes, we can move. We can have one more round of question, and then we'll open the floor.
Yeah. So I guess I'm wondering. So I opened by saying that part of this revolution is in deciding who the new archivists are, right? Or the quality or the categories for being archivists have sort of broadened. And I guess my question is slightly similar or a slightly different take is, when does a collection become an archive? And perhaps even more importantly, is archive the correct word to describe the evidence that we're talking about, or to describe the materials that we are talking about? Perhaps perhaps there's a better word to indicate this very new thing. So I'll leave it at that. And I'll just repeat, since people like to take notes: when does something become an archive? And is archive the right word to describe the material that we are now collecting in these revolutions?
Well, I will jump in before I forget the question. I think this is also a very interesting question that comes up around social media more generally, which is how do you know that a coherent conversation is happening amongst a group of people, and how do you then ascertain that something that you can then credit that conversation for something that's happening in the real world? And I think, you know, there are a lot of efforts by people to create things like hashtags and other signifiers that are meant to bring disparate bits of ephemera online into something that feels cohesive. But yet, when you look at those things, it doesn't always necessarily make an easy kind of set of parameters, because we also see how people utilize hashtags for, let's say, for resistive purposes, right? Or turn them around. And so I think part of what we find with social media is a kind of utopian impulse or optimism that because now everyone can participate, that we now have the ability to really create this kind of objective view, or with many, many perspectives from different types of people. And that this will create an archive of human experience that will much more closely resemble reality than a very top-down kind of view of things, except that you can't really, then there's just a whole host of actors involved in that project, and not all of them are reliable, and not all of them have the same intention. So you have people who are not necessarily, who are actively trying to destroy the archive by using forms of signification to make it something that's not coherent. So I think the question of whether or not the term archive is useful is also very helpful, because it's a question asking whether or not we are trying to impose our understanding of the ways things are collected and make it legible to ourselves on what people are doing, instead of allowing for the possibility of the emergence of something, another practice that we can name and talk about. And so I'm always wary of how those of us who want to study and think about these things, are also utilizing terminology to describe things preemptively, when perhaps the reality of it is that it's not an archive, and it's something else that we want to talk about as a collective kind of productivity of knowledge, or production of knowledge, or information, or data, or whatever you want to call it.
Should I go next, or Yasmina? Okay, so I like to answer the question. I think the way we traditionally think of an archive, like when we talk about how historians deal with the archive, it is basically data or material that's in the far past. Like it is, so there's a significant temporal break between the archive and the historian, for instance, and we borrow that word to use it in the digital realm, where these temporalities are all collapsed. So as Isra was saying, for instance, when we think about smartphones, they're both for storage and broadcast, and these two functions are intimately linked in the way that that they are used. So the archive, basically storing a record of what's happening, is thought of as intrinsic to the activist basically role in like when you are present in that situation. So like the idea of temporal collapse, it makes the word, it's kind of like a different sense of the archive that we think of in like the traditional sense. And I think what gives it meaning and makes it like still important to use is because it is about a political event that people are invested in. So it is like we use the word in relation to the, let's say, in the 2011 uprisings, because a lot of people are invested in that political moment as when they think about their emancipation and agency, and that political commitment to that event makes us, all think that archiving it is important. And I think even as Yasmina was also saying, like even back then, people were already thinking about archiving it as it is actually happening. So
it's very hard for me to respond to that question with I don't feel like there's one answer to it, and I also feel that in different moments with this particular archive that I've been working on, there's been different there's different moments of when did that archive already become an archive, and then later one would question that archive that did not become yet, and we would continue on also redefining what it was. And I think it's in also the that attempt of maybe not giving it not exactly knowing or knowing that that in different moments it meant something else for it to, the definition of becoming was different in different moments, gives it more I want to say it makes it more radical in these different moments. So I'm thinking about the moment when of the beginning of the revolution with the media tent and collecting the materials, and that already in itself was the becoming of an archive. But then what happens when you edit that and then you share it through social media and it's on YouTube and it gets a lot of views, which also means that then it is replicated over and over again, and it appears on other platforms, and it's re-narrated, and that also is a whole other archive. And then what happens when that is shown on the street? Well, that archive, that that material that was filmed on the street, then re-edited or creating a counter narrative to what the state was presenting at the time on television, and then screened on the street in Tahrir, for instance, what kind of response that got? That was filmed and then replicated again. That material that we presented in the square was then also replicated in itself with multiple screenings that happened around Cairo and then around Egypt with the Kazibun campaign, which was a campaign against the military. So suddenly you have the same video shown in various places and replicated and re-edited. And then that becomes a whole other archive, or that becomes, again, an archive of in the making, I would say. Yeah, I think I don't want to take too much time. That's a very interesting question.
All right, I think at that point we want to open the floor to questions, if that's all right with everyone. I think there was one person, Nina, I think wanted to ask a question verbally. You should be able to unmute yourself, Nina, or if you use the raise hand function, you'll pop to the top of my my sheet here, and I can probably.
I'm unmuted now. Does
there
that
you
work?
go. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much to the speakers and to the organizers. This is really such an interesting talk. I did my PhD mainly about Musserine and have spoken to Yasmina back then, and now I'm working on a project on collective archiving in Syria, or a sub-project of a main project called Archiving the Future, about image archives from Syria. So I would like to go back to something that we spoke about, Yasmina, some years back. You were talking about, like, and you mentioned it today as well, the urgency of documenting and getting things out. That was so important for the work of Musserine at that time, from 11 to 13. And then you mentioned how the archive, the process of sort of making your collection of footage into an archive, into the 858 archive, there's no deadline on it. It wasn't, you know, it was a different, there's a different urgency to it. So I guess one of my questions, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, Yasmina, but also if others want to comment, about the when of the archive, like when is it for? And Omar, you were talking about the lack of images from Hamat, and I think that's extremely interesting to think about in that context. Is this images that we want to engage in the present or in the future, or how do the archives, when do the archives matter? And then my other questions, which is related to this, is who it's for. I was doing an interview the other day and with a Syrian photographer who showed an image to me, which was really, really strong. And it was an image I'd seen many times, but always sort of tried not to look at because it's so difficult to look at. So when we were talking about this image, and he showed me as an important image for him, and I really felt forced to look at it. And I felt in a sense that I owed that to him. So that's my other question about who the archives are for. Who are they committed to, or who are they responsible to? Is it the people in the archive, the people in the images, the photographers? Is it the future? Is it the children? You know, the future of Syria. Who are the archives for? Thank you.
Hi, Nina. Nice to see you and hear you. It's been a while, and I think yeah, we had this conversation before around these questions, and I think sadly there's also there's a lot that, since we had that conversation, did not change in terms of like what this archive could propose further. You ask who is it for? I feel that up until 2014, up until the military crackdown on Muslim Brotherhood and on journalists, on activists, on personal freedoms, very violent crackdown and arrests. Up until then, we had a much wider imagination around what this archive could do in the future and how it could grow, and something that we started, and it's not something that will end. It's always in the making, is the idea around annotating. And I mean, the particular platform that we're using, Pandora, allows for various users who want to be part of that archive, somewhat people who also we trust, they trust us, and that can grow into like who are the narrators then, is to expand on the idea of, around narrating also what what happened in the past. And there's different ways of narrating. You can narrate it from the perspective of 10 years later. And while you annotate, someone else can create a series of other annotations within that. And what I like about that possibility is that there's no limit to how many hashtags one creates also within hashtags. I mean, maybe this sounds a bit abstract, but if you go to 858 to the archive and you enter and you choose, you look through the footage, some of that footage is already annotated, meaning it has a series of keywords that refer to particular moments within that footage that you're watching. And I think, I mean, this is something that was very important to us. Is, you know, we had a YouTube channel that served a specific purpose at the time, because it was also very popular and people would watch it. It allowed us to very quickly also respond to what was being said on TV. But then with this platform, it allows us much more to also expand on this idea of authorship and one narrative or one narration. Yeah, thinking a bit wider and who are the spectators, but also who are the participants and who are the various people filming in this at the same time. Who narrates the revolution? This is also the question. This is who it is also very much for.
And just to add something, just briefly, because I think it's important to mention that first of all, like the archive is needs to exist in a way before, because if there is no effort to collect this information, we will not get the chance to answer this question. And we can see that in the digital realm, because we saw, for instance, when it came to Syria, how YouTube deleted a lot of the videos from 2011 because it's because of its rules around violence or lazy ways to kind of designate terrorist material. So if those videos aren't saved, then they're lost. And when we talk about YouTube, it is obviously a corporate archive, because it depends on what YouTube, the company, basically it depends on the algorithm, it depends on their policies. So that is why the archiving itself, even from the very beginning, is important, before we know who it is for or what purpose it would hold in the future, because our relationship also to these material changes as well. And there is, of course, a legal dimension for this. If there are any crimes, that footage, for instance, for any crimes that are shown, so there is that dimension, which is contingent on political circumstances and the kind of more effective relations that we were discussing earlier.
Thank you.
I don't know if Isra or Marie want to jump on that question. We have a couple questions in the chat that we might want to just throw out there too, and let folks go around. They're a little bit expansive, so but you can see them in detail in the chat, but I'm going to try and summarize them as quickly as I can here. Reem Judy has really 3 questions, but all that have to do with, what difference does it make when we're thinking about a digital archive that is more centered on text versus non-textual material? Does it does it change the way effective relationships are made with these kinds of archives? Does it matter, what languages they're in, who they're communicating to, et cetera? And then a question from Anna, which is fundamentally about what happens to a digital archive when it's not on view. How do we separate out digital archives that aren't broadcast widely, that aren't circulating in the way that we like to normally think of social media, produced phones and things like that. And what does that mean for the life of an archive?
I do just want to jump in. I think that one thing that might be helpful to consider when we're considering the question of visibility overall is that there's an economy of attention in social media that is a larger economic framework overall, in which one is able to translate visibility into monetary gain if you do it correctly, right? And so there's a way in which we want to consider how the need to draw attention also, when we're trying to do that in the context of political uprisings or specific moments of response, how that general sort of framework of visibility being the best possible outcome, for example, or the way in which you try to gain visibility through broadcasting sensationalistic images, or trying to focus on really the most intense kind of affective images might shape also things. And then I think that plays a lot into the question of what types of archives become seen versus ones, what types of information or data kind of manages to recede into the background. And so I think the question of when something becomes an archive is actually a much longer question than the digital, because this is a question that has come up in history over a long period of time, right? And part of what you've seen over the last few decades, the kind of corrective move in different historical fields about finding archives that would have been overlooked before or not been valued as archives before, like say a group of queer women in Brooklyn who create an archive of zines that wouldn't have been considered, even textual material wouldn't have been considered important enough to look at until there's a turn amongst scholars towards thinking about those materials as valuable. So I think even thinking about textual versus visual material, we might consider that the relationship might be more about whether or not people consider things like GIFs or memes to be serious materials or valuable materials, and then how that impacts whether or not something is seen as an archive. So I don't know if I'm directly answering those questions, but I think those are perhaps helpful things to think about, both the attention economy and then when something is actually designated an archive. Is it at the moment where it's recognized by someone, or the moment at which someone makes it with intention, or a combination of those things?
Could I jump in with a response? Just thinking about the importance, again, and this I think echoes Nina's question about who is doing the viewing, right? So as we do this economy of viewership, which viewership, right, is being calculated and monetized and recognized as valid and legitimate viewership, and I mean, and this is the eternal archival question, right, is that so many people are either not represented in it and or don't have access to it. And so I think one of the questions that we have to ask of these digital collections is about dissemination, right, to these wider bodies and populations that have been marginalized. And I hope that we recognize that kind of dissemination, distribution, making available for viewership. Yasmina talked about the filming on the street, moving to somewhere else and being edited and coming back to the street. There's so much labor that's involved in that. And I think that if we are intent upon disrupting archives, then much of our effort has to be not only in collecting, but then also in making sure that viewers, right, are not just the traditional hegemonic archive visitor, right? As Isra had said, right, bringing the archive to particular groups and particular demographics.
Yeah, like just to answer the question, Reem's question about keywords and collective memory. So my point was that I think like we have to be attentive to the like the meanings that words store and how they circulate, and how they're also enmeshed in the realm of the affective. And so that is why words, like especially at times of revolution and kind of like hyped up activist moments when there's such euphoria, there becomes a reformulation of words that go back to perhaps like their use in past eras. So words from even the like anti-colonial moment in the Arab world re-emerged in 2011 and gained and circulated in new ways and gained new meanings. So that is like a lot of this work, I think, has to be inductive in terms of how this played out in different political spaces, and how it was circulated, for instance, on Instagram, as you say, but particularly in Arabic, when we're talking about one language that's used in many different contexts. It is important to actually do this work, because if we like my word, for instance, that I think about a lot is revolution, and revolution may have meant something different in Egypt, for instance, than in Lebanon in the previous year. And like, especially that if we think about revolution, it's always a word that kind of provokes reactions like, no, how can you call it revolution? It's not a revolution, like what? And I think it is, so it is important to be aware about temporality in relation to the words we use. So that's kind of like what I was getting at. But of course, it is basically a big undertaking to think about how it plays out in different places. So that's why this special issues project I'm excited about, and in looking at what words will people actually come up with, and how they will reflect on them.
I would like to quickly respond to Lara Beladi. Hi, Lara. You're asking, and Lara Beladi is involved in the Tahrir cinema, the screenings on Tahrir back in 2011.
Hi, Yasmina.
Hi. Nice to hear you.
Nice to hear you too.
Your question is very important. How do you validate, filter the annotations, and do you? And it's a very important question that is also a question that we revisit, because to remind us all here, the archive, the 858 project has its moments of intense labor, and then has moments where we can't also meet and have these kind of discussions, and they are very important. One of the ideas that we had, and we did have one gathering of that sort, is to think about a group of how to open the archive to annotating, and who are the annotators. So one of the things that we thought of is to have a workshop around annotating, where various people meet who were involved in the uprising at the time, and people who participated and who also influenced the making of this material. Lawyers, doctors, friends, and of course how to open and where to have this kind of workshop, given current political situation in Egypt, and the fact that a lot of us in the group in Mussolin are dispersed, and is also then a question, how do you then do that? And I think this is where further discussion between us also needs to happen, and we need to have another retreat where we could do that. But of course, we are also aware of the fact that it's not an open archive. If it was completely open and everyone could log in and annotate and change and delete, and of course there's different levels of usership also on that platform, then something else happens, something that is maybe perhaps also dangerous to that narrative. But then again, the question, so who are the gatekeepers and why? So of course, this is what I read into your question around filtering the annotations and who validates and so on. And at the moment, we're in the process of also figuring that out, and we're not doing it right now either. Yes.
Thank you guys so much. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anyone else wants to raise their hand with a question, they should be able to. We're coming up to time, and I thought maybe I had one question, if I could just pose that out, and then we could probably end the formal period of the event. One thing I was thinking quite a lot about in the run up to this event, and then it came out very much earlier in Omar's presentation, as well as in Yasmina's, was the way these archives, these digital archives, are sort of punctuated or limited in some way by violent events. Is it you know, on the one hand, I think that's something important to think about in terms of calling these things archives. If we're going to say, like, you know, this is an archive of you know, a revolution. It begins with a violent event. It probably ends with a violent event. How do we deal and square with the kinds of things that we're archiving if this is like prominently what we're featuring? But in addition to that, there's a question of how, and this was a little bit in the prompt, is how we include in the archive the way people participate in an uprising or a protest by watching these things, you know, and being affected by them and recording that affection, whether it's through interaction through social media or in some other way. You know, how do we bring in the people that are viewing an uprising through their phones, viewing probably a violent event, I mean, or a protest, a clash with police, as I was even doing on my own phone just last night. You know, how do we incorporate that into the what we call an archive in this digital moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think that I'll just answer briefly before I forget that. Yeah, like, I think this is a very important point, particularly about violence, and it has to do, you know, if we go back to what we were saying about like the centrality of the body, but there is also, when we talk about the mediation aspect, it is also kind of we have to think about the price that a lot of people pay to actually whether to witness, if we want to call it witnessing, or if we want to think of it in relation to archiving. Now I'm working on a piece which is co-authored by with my colleague Billy Kholiaraki, and we're basically talking about this concept of flesh witnessing, and how in order for activists to have their digital media output disseminated through global news networks, it is like they have to pay with their flesh, in risking their bodies to get that footage, as there is this hunger, as was said before, to what is like this aesthetic of the authentic, as like there's already literature on that. So it is also about risking one's body, and about like basically the risk of death in certain situations, to be able to archive or to even witness. And so this is perhaps like the darker side of that global mediation of violence, because it comes at the expense of those whose bodies are closest to that violence, and it almost becomes a condition for their mediation. But of course, there is a positive side in the sense that when we talk about activism, it is also very transnational, and like we see from 10 years ago until now how people from around the world in various different countries took from each other certain, whether it's certain slogans or certain chants, or were inspired by each other to kind of keep doing activism and so forth. So that there is a kind of a good side and a very dark side, because of obviously there's immense power relations in that mediation process.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think returning to the question of when I think about this, the question of suffering in these particular moments, and the uses of suffering in the context of an attention economy that is going to make certain more sensationalistic kind of images or events, put those at the forefront, and potentially the use of those images to try to incite more reaction. And I think Ariella Azule's work rather is helpful for thinking about what she calls the civil contract that occurs when you witness suffering. And so there's a way in which images of suffering can circulate very widely, but create not very much reaction. And so the question becomes, what happens when we deploy images of particular forms of violence? Who does it cost, and does it actually create a response from people? And how do we encourage people to think of themselves as participating as part of a civil contract, so that they can't just see images of things or videos of things and then just leave and say, well, that happened over there. And you can't separate the experience of viewing from the experience of feeling or having it change your way of thinking or seeing the world. But again, we live in a larger social media context where people aren't seeing these images alone, right? And so what you're seeing is one image of intense violence, and then like a Wendy's commercial, and then these things are moving in a context kind of together, and there's a purpose for that, right? It's done purposefully as a way to desensitize and try to get people to detach from things. So there's a simultaneous sort of desire to illustrate the most violent things in order to show the deepest injustice, and to document moments, especially like last night, the NYPD brutalizing people on the street in Manhattan. And yet also the question is, how do we contextualize that in a way that actually forces people to take on the responsibility of witnessing and not just passive consumption, right? And so how do we encourage that? I think that's a practice that has to go beyond the individual moment in which we're viewing these things, and goes to a larger sort of set of practices and ideas that we have to cultivate in terms of viewing and engaging any type of political or other forms of discourse that matter, right, to the world.
I don't know if Yasmina or Marie want to pick that up, but we might want to cap things a little bit there, if that's okay. Thank you guys so much, Omar, Yasmina, Isra, Marie. This was really a fantastic conversation, and I certainly got quite a lot out of it. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I'm going to stop the recording soon, but we also invite you to hang out for a little bit, chit chat. Looks like we might be a small enough group that we can all stick in one room. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you again soon.